Welcome to a fantastic edition of Rebellion's educational series. I'm here with the Nobel Prize winning professor from Stanford, Chicago. Paul Romer is really a hero and an icon in the field of economics. To have him on today is absolutely life's honor. Paul, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Sometimes people give that whole litany of, it was like University of Rochester to Chicago, Berkeley, Stanford, NYU. And I always feel like when people give that introduction, it's kind of like, come on, guy, why can't you hold a job? I mean, why do you have to keep leaving town every few years? But I have moved around quite a bit.
No, and chief economist of the World Bank. You're one of the most respected minds in America and academically globally. So today, I'd love to talk to you about hyperinflation, what we can learn from history, and protecting science. So let's start with hyperinflation. Do you see it? Is it here?
It's definitely not here. And I think the people who are worried about it are overestimating the risks. At least at the moment, at this epoch, we have central banks that know how to keep inflation under control. So as inflation starts to pick up, they will do their job. They'll slow things down. This is the amazing legacy of the decisions that Paul Volcker took in the 1980s. In the 70s, many economists were seriously concerned that inflation might forever keep increasing and just spiral out of control. We had a series of episodes of inflation going up, a slowdown during a recession, but then going up even more after that. But Volcker just completely turned things around and showed that if a central bank wants to stop inflation, a central bank can do it. And so in the wake of that discovery, I think we're not going to see the kind of hyperinflation we saw during the 20s and 30s.
Interesting. And so how do you feel about migration? Is New York going to stay the power it is? How much will Florida attract? Where do you see the next few years with those two states?
If I compare hyperinflation and migration strikes me as a much more serious problem. It's funny, at the bank, I used to have trouble with people. I would tell them, I don't want to worry about the problem that we might have. I want to worry about the problems we do have. Let's work on those first. We have a huge problem with potential migration around the world in the following sense. There are 750 million people who report when asked that they would like to leave and move to another country right now. The world has no capacity to accommodate that kind of desire right now. And if it happens in an uncontrolled way, what we saw in Europe is that modest migration flows, on the order of like 1 million people, could threaten the political stability of an entire nation. So we have kind of European democracy that survived the threat of fascism, the threat from communism, which might be destroyed by uncontrolled migration. So it's this kind of ticking time bomb, and we have no way to manage it that's really, I think, morally acceptable. All we're trying to do is just force people to stay in conditions of real misery and desperation, and we should be trying harder to give them a chance to find someplace better to go.
Are we talking about 476 Rome here, or how bad could it get for Europe?
Well, I think if you look at what's happened in Hungary, for example, and you see an erosion of institutions of government as opposed to the further strengthening of those institutions, and you look at the influence of some of the parties on the right in other countries in Europe, and the return of kind of violence, right-wing extremists who are willing to resort to violence. These are signs of a real erosion of a kind of a quality of life that's built up over centuries.
What are your thoughts on the Turkish lira falling maybe 80% in value over the last 5 years due to Erdogan's very, awful policies, according to many?
Unfortunately, with Turkey, this is kind of deja vu all over again. When I was saying we won't have hyperinflation, we won't have like depression of the kind we had during the 1930s. That's true in countries that have reasonably effective institutions. Turkey is still a country that doesn't have strong enough institutions of government to manage the basics of macroeconomic stability. So it's going to go through it's going through another cycle of, kind of crisis and turmoil. You just hope cumulatively they'll start to develop the capacity that other countries have to just manage a floating exchange rate and keep the economy growing at a stable rate.
So when you look at a country like Turkey or a country like Venezuela, your feeling is that the hyperinflation that's been experienced there is just due to a degrading of the government agencies and a lack of trust in the government.
Yeah, I mean, if the government can't function, if you don't have people who can make the right decisions and do their jobs, you could indeed end up with hyperinflation. So this is my confidence about how things will play out in the West is a sign of my general confidence in the institutions of government. But we shouldn't be complacent about this, because you can destroy institutions of government.
I've got to ask you about Russia then.
Yeah.
How do you feel about the way Putin, who clearly seems to be a strong man in power, how he has been able to navigate Russia's economy? And I'd love your thoughts there.
Yeah. Well, when people look back at the era of my lifespan, I think the thing the historians will focus first on the successful transition from communism to sort of a more modern economy in China, and they'll contrast it with the failure to make that transition, or the much more unsuccessful transition in Russia.
But do you think it was simply due to one man gaining power, whereas one man did not gain power in China? Is there more to it?
I don't think so. If Putin were to have a heart attack and die, I think there'd still be these systemic weaknesses in Russia that would lead to another autocrat like Putin in charge, or would lead to the takeover of the economy by a bunch of gangs and thugs and competing gangs and thugs. And those are your two choices. I can see why the people of Russia would rather have an autocrat than a bunch of competing thugs fighting with each other. But what's unfortunate is they didn't establish just the basic institutions of kind of rule of law and governance, and establish a process for a gradual evolution of those institutions. This idea that the Big Bang would be the right way to make the transition that some of my colleagues recommended, I think it's really not worked well at all.
So then when you look at Napoleon, for instance, he was able to keep value because he made sure his government agencies were respected, despite being an authoritarian. Would you say he ruled without fear, more respect?
Yeah, well, I guess the way I would judge this would be to ask, in a nation, can the system of governance attract some of the most talented people in that nation to help the government do its job? And if it can still attract the most talented people, it'll have the human capital and the skill, and it's got the respect to do the kind of job a government has to do. And if it can't, then the nation's in for a hard road.
Well, very, very well said, Paul. Really very well said. So let's get to America's migration. Do you see urban strengthening? Do you see more of a shift to kind of country and suburban life? Where do you see the mix of country, suburban, urban over the next 10 years?
Well, as you know, I've thought a lot about the emergence of new cities. And I think of a city as something on a scale of about, say, 10 million people. There's many different scales, but say 10 million people. There are some people who are still talking about creating new cities in the United States. I don't know that there's enough demand to make it viable, unfulfilled demand for urban life to make it viable to start a new city in the United States. We see that like prices for land and residential properties have generally gone up in the most successful cities, but we have lots of cities where they haven't gone up. So the dynamics I think that's playing out is that just as in industry, the biggest cities have a substantial advantage compared to the medium-sized ones. So it's a kind of a winner-take-all dynamic where the biggest cities are going to keep getting bigger. People say in rural areas could move into some of the declining cities, but they can't move into the most successful cities. And we haven't figured out as a nation how to manage that whole ecosystem. So we do have people in rural areas who really feel like they're being left behind. And a lot of our political polarization right now is along the lines of the successful urban, elite centers and the marginalized rural places where people are feeling left behind. But as I said, I don't think just starting a brand new city is necessarily going to, it's worth considering, but I don't think it's necessarily the best strategy for the nation. I suspect if we could figure out how to do it with a light touch, the best thing for the US would be to make sure we have a number of competing centers in the country. So take, for example, housing prices. In New York, if you're a young, man and woman who want to start a family, they didn't complete college. It's just almost impossible to move to New York and have a prospect of owning a house. But they can move to Houston, where they keep building new housing, where the price of housing is not so high. A couple like that can actually get a start in Houston. So it's good that this country has both a New York and a Houston and other competing cities. So I would kind of try and aim policy toward making sure there are enough successful cities that that compete with each other and that are trying hard to not become one of those declining cities where people are left behind. So that would be my strategy for the United States relative to, say, Venezuela, where the government has just completely collapsed. I think we should be thinking about how can we create a city where 10, maybe a couple of them, 20 million Venezuelans could move to and just leave the country, because forcing them to stay is trapping them in conditions where they can't thrive. And I think the threat of losing so many of your people is one of the most powerful ways to discipline a government which is misbehaving.
I know it's tough. What to do? Do you want to send in military or take?
Oh, I know the answer to that one. No,
Yes.
no, we do not want to occupy any place. But I think we could create these kind of secure enclaves. That actually brings me to.
Are you an Apocalypse Now person? What do you say?
No. Well, I mean, I just saw the movie within the last year. My wife, said, Paul, you cannot be a literate person if you haven't seen Apocalypse Now. So I just watched it recently, but I'm not a like emotionally connected with the kind of the military experience, but I do think that military organizations play a very important role. But if you just do the math about the U.S. Kind of efforts in the Middle East, like Iraq, Iran, we were spending about $130,000 per square kilometer to try and stabilize and these countries.
Yes, and George W. Bush's investment in the Iraq War was the worst investment in the last, maybe in humankind.
Yeah, and if you look at like a place like New York City, I mean, we spend far more than $130,000 a year to secure a square kilometer. So instead of trying to spread our resources so thinly, if we'd focus those resources on, like 1/100th of that amount of area, and just a few cities, a few places the size of, Hong Kong or Singapore, New York City, those we could have kept secure with the kind of expenditure like New York spends on police each year, which is, maybe 5 to 10 times what we were spending in those countries. If we'd made some secure cities, those could have succeeded. But the military, the military intervention strategy failed because we were spread too thinly. The other thing was that you can't make a place secure unless you can run the police force. You don't secure an area with an army, you need a police. And to run the police, you got to have some system of government that works. You can't have corrupt competing gangs. So I wish we'd thought about creating security by establishing places that were like Hong Kong, rather than by trying to go in and occupy the way we did in Iraq, because the Iraq strategy, the Afghanistan strategy, they've just completely failed.
Well, I mean, that was essentially the ethos of Apocalypse Now, that there was no strategy and that the Americans were just kind of doing this clown parade.
Yeah. And also, I mean, you got to recognize you're dealing with people, people, it's not like they're cattle or machines. They have their own desires. They have their own wishes, their own beliefs, and you can't, through force, just compel them to do something you want. What you can do, though, is you can offer them opportunities. So if you create a place that's kind of like a new Hong Kong and say, look, if you want to come raise a family, get your kids educated, have a job, here's a place you can do it. But we're not going to force it on you. If you don't want that, you don't have to have it. So if we recognize that people need to be able to make their own choices, but then create options for them, I think we could do a better job of helping people who want something different. And we'd have a much more potent tool for destabilizing a regime like Venezuela. If you think about what really destroyed the legitimacy of government in communist, say East Germany, when a government actually has to threaten to kill people to keep them from escaping, you're beyond the point where you can pretend there's any legitimacy there. Yep. So I think we should just be making it clear that lots of people want to leave Venezuela if they had a chance. We just need to create a place where they will go, and I think that will ultimately, topple the terrible regime that's in place there.
So you believe in investing in super cities? Really?
Well, I think the basic unit, I think, is like, you should, if you're going to start a new city, you should make sure you could get to 10 million people. I think that's like the minimum viable, kind of product in the city market. There will be cities that will, or kind of urban areas that will grow to 50, 100 million people. We don't know for sure how those are going to turn out. Each time we get to a certain size, we say, oh, surely this is the biggest size. Like, oh, and if you look back in history, you couldn't possibly have a city of more than 1 million people, or more than 5 million, or more than 10. We might finally get to a point where we say, oh, it really wasn't possible to make it work when you're above 50 million. But who knows? Maybe the 50 million to 100 million places will turn out to be the most, most exciting, productive places to work. But I'm pretty sure that the cities of 1 million people are not going to be competitive in that global market. Like, think of the most talented young people who are thinking about where to go get a job. They can go anywhere. They're unlikely to go to a city of less than 1 million people when they've got these cities of 10 million or more they can move to.
With affordable housing and strong police.
Right. If they, if they're safe, right. If the housing is affordable, right. Exactly. Yeah.
No, definitely. So let's talk about protecting science. I know you're very passionate about that.
Yeah. So the amazing thing about the progress that humans have made is that it's the result of discovering facts. If we know what's true, we can use that truth to do amazing things. So if we're guided by the truth instead of by dogma, all kinds of opportunities open up to us. Science is this remarkable system for discovering the truth. It's the only system humans have ever established for converging on agreement about even agreement of any kind that doesn't involve coercion. Everything else involved, coercion. But because science is so effective at establishing and convincing people of the truth, we've got billions of people all over the planet who've converged on beliefs about what's true. But it depends on a certain set of, it's a social system, and it depends on certain kinds of behaviors and just activities that are essential to make it work. One of the things that is critical to science is the notion of a reputation. I don't just publish an anonymous paper. I put my name on a paper, so that if it turns out that if I report some data and I fudged the data, I cheated, people will find that, and then they'll know I was the one who did it, and then I will be effectively, excommunicated. I will never be taken seriously as a scientist again. But we've got a whole generation of young people who've grown up thinking, oh, communication should be anonymous. You should just look at what I write. You shouldn't have to know who I am. And what they're going to discover is that without reputations, that where people try and maintain a reputation for being trustworthy and reliable, we're just going to have a world that's just with this proliferation of fakes and deep fakes and deeper fakes. Yeah. And we're not going to be able to establish what's true anymore.
Of course, Kroc always said McDonald's great value was the trustworthiness people felt in the name McDonald's. And if you don't have trust, what do you have? And so there is so much of a problem with anonymous it's kind of spam out there. So when you
imagine there was a warehouse and there was just a single window where things could come in and out, and you can go there and say, well, I want to get some food. They say, sure, okay, but we're the anonymous food provider. We'll give you some food, but you don't know who we are. And people would not go buy food from the anonymous food provider. And in the same way, I don't see how these young people think that you can have a world of science or intellectual discourse without reputations and trust that's built on people trying to protect their reputations.
So I guess you're referring to the vaccination situation that's going on in the United States, and
that's one side of it. But I think it is an issue that goes back further. The emergence of digital communication has just radically changed things. So it's much tougher to establish a reputation in the world of digital communication. Let me give you an example. I've started to learn to code, and I think code will be one of the ways we communicate in science, just like math became a critical language for communication. So I have a GitHub site. There's a picture of me there. People can go download code. It dawned on me at some point that anybody out there could get a picture of me, create a GitHub account, say this is Paul Romer, NYC, and pretend to be me. And then other academics could unknowingly go download, say, malware, thinking they're getting software from me. So I need a way to establish at GitHub or on my blog or on Twitter. I need a way to establish, no, this is the place you can count on, where the Paul Romer, who's
that's a brilliant point. If I came across a Paul Romer GitHub account, I would assume it's just a Paul Romer fan who wanted to put stuff up, and he could be from Ukraine for all I know.
Yeah. There was. I discovered somebody sent me a Twitter account where someone was using my picture as the part of the profile for the Twitter account. They weren't trying to use my name for some reason, but randomly they had just taken my picture. And I realized we're so prone to just trust the image. It's like a simulation of being face to face with the person. And we've just failed to take on board how easy it's going to be to fake things like pictures, like borrow them or fake them. So we need to figure out how to have like digital communication, but where we have some assurance about who it is we're dealing with. It's a little bit like what Twitter Verified does, but we need to create a system where individuals are actually in control. That I can do it. I don't have to go ask Twitter for this. I can find a way to establish my reputation and put my seal, my digital signature on things. Another episode that made me realize how serious this is was when I got an email that pretended to be from Paul Romer. And so I knew that wasn't Paul Romer, but I started thinking, how does anybody else know whether that's me or not? So we need some new tools to just facilitate, know who you're dealing with, and protect against the imposters.
No, that's an absolutely great point.
Yeah, and just if I can just do a tiny bit of self-promotion. This is actually the thing I'm most engaged in right now. I'm starting a new nonprofit where part of our goal is to make it possible for anybody, like starting with academics, but ultimately a journalist, a person who takes photographs. I mean, anybody has a mechanism for establishing that any digital artifact that they produced was actually produced by them, so that we can have reputations in this world of digital communication like we used to have in the old world of analog communication.
Speaking of reputations, my all-time science hero is probably Richard Feynman. Do you have a
Yeah.
science hero that's inspired you?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, Feynman is he's right up there at the top. I do quote him sometimes when I try and convey the spirit of science.
My uncle worked with him. My great uncle worked with him at the Manhattan Project, and
Yeah,
yeah, no, he was an amazing individual, and
yeah.
his ability to make everything simple and practical was what drew me.
Yep. Yeah. I think, Einstein was somebody who is a younger person I had great kind of admiration for. And it inspired me a little bit to know that, that he had not been like a stellar student when he was, first starting out. So, but I think Feynman actually did a better job of something that I've really come to believe is so important, which is it's not enough to just discover a truth or an insight or a better way to think about something. You got to figure out how to communicate it to others. So attention to just careful exposition, careful communication is undervalued, and we underinvest in it. But Feynman was somebody who did an extraordinary job and it was just through hard work and persistence of coming up with better ways to explain to others, here's how to think about it, including this kind of amazing device of the Feynman diagram for thinking about these complex questions. So
I have that book on my
really
shelf.
admire that about him. Sorry?
I said I have a Feynman diagram book on my shelf, but
Yeah.
I would have to say that his O-ring talk for the
Yeah.
calendar explosion might have been one of the coolest moments of the 20th century from a science perspective.
I've never seen that. After we
Oh,
finish,
you
I'll
must. It's one of my favorites. I've watched it 100 times. It's just marvelous.
Yeah, yeah. A related thing I do think about sometimes is, who do I describe as my heroes? And so there are some people in the world of science, but I also like to remind people about, say, Paul Volcker, who spent his whole life working for the US government, or Dwight Eisenhower. These were individuals who made important decisions. We had a system where they had the ability to make a decision. They knew they would be held responsible if they made the wrong decision. But instead of hesitating, instead of like setting up committees, or having some legalistic process, these were people who took responsibility, made crucial decisions, and decisions that turned out to be right, and were, kind of pivotal in creating the world that we live in today. So I wish more people appreciated the power that one can have if you're a leader in these positions in the government, and not just think about becoming a leader, say, in some tech startup.
Was the rebuilding of Europe your favorite of Eisenhower's decisions, or?
Oh, I think the story that's the most interesting, I think, was the decision about when to launch the D-Day invasion. John Kennedy met Eisenhower at Kennedy's inauguration, and Kennedy, making small talk, asked, what was the most important element in the success of the D-Day invasion? And without hesitating, Eisenhower said it was our meteorologists, better scientists who understood weather, who helped Eisenhower make this critical decision about whether to postpone or go ahead in times when the weather was bad. And I think it's a great example for thinking about COVID. Eisenhower did not, quote, follow the science. He knew that he had to make the decision ultimately about whether to go ahead, but he listened to the scientists. He said, tell me everything you know. What's your best guess? What's your range of uncertainty? So the scientists contributed in a very important way. They saw that the weather was really terrible, but it was likely to get somewhat better. And there were some real risks if they postponed and waited, to the next opportunity. So Eisenhower decided to go ahead. The Germans saw the same bad weather, didn't realize it might get a little bit better. They assumed the Americans wouldn't launch the invasion. And so they were unprepared. There were people were off on a training exercise. Some of the leaders weren't at their posts. So the Americans, I always thought that that the bad weather made it harder for the invasion to succeed. It may actually have made it easier because the Germans were much less prepared when we actually did the launch. But
There's
the
nothing like
reason I
that.
love this story is because it kind of reminds us that there's an important role for science, but there's ultimately a different role for a leader who's got to take all of the information and make a decision. And during COVID, I think what we had was too little leadership and too many scientists who thought that they should be in charge when that wasn't really their job.
Fantastic points. Such a wonderful conversation. I couldn't be more thankful, Paul. This was really just awesome.
Yeah. Well, I guess if I'm trying to think about anything what could I end up on? I imagine you'll have some viewers who are young people, some who are like old like me, and kind of doesn't matter if I can change their minds. But they're young people. I hope I can encourage a few young people to think about the amazing career they can have in the domain of science, where they're part of something that's bigger than themselves, where they contribute to something, but also possibly, if our systems stay functional, the influence they could have if they become leaders in government as well. Science and government are both ways to contribute to something that's larger than ourselves. And I think the biggest risk for somebody in terms of having a successful career is narcissism and self-absorption. And the thing that leads to successful lives, I think, is to be part of something which is larger than yourself. And the military does this for some people too. I hope young people will consider that as well. But don't just think that becoming the leader of some startup is the only way to have a successful life.
No, of course. That's so well said. Making the world a better place is self-fulfilling.
I wouldn't quite phrase it that way, because that's almost become like a parody of what they say in Silicon Valley. The way I say it though is be part of something that's bigger than you, that you believe in, so that you'll contribute to it, but it will outlast you and it will give your life meaning.
That's they say it in Silicon Valley because they feel that they don't have the meaning, and so they want to pretend that they do have the meaning. Yeah. Whereas working in science, you know what you're doing.
Trivial apps where they're just trying to get rich and take over a market, and they try to imbue it with some meaning. One of the things that was sad at Stanford was that I used to see these business people who'd come to Stanford after they'd made a bunch of money, and it was like they were saying, well, I made a bunch of money, but I don't have any meaning in my life, so I want to hang out with you academics because you guys seem to have something going on. And it just seemed like, gosh, why did you waste your whole life chasing all of this money? Didn't you know in advance it was going to turn out this way? But unfortunately, most people seem not to realize that.
So follow the heart. That's
and meaning. Think about what gives your life meaning, because that's more important than most people realize.
Heart and meaning. I love this. Paul, this was really fantastic.
Okay, well,
thank you so much.
I enjoyed it. I'm going to go. What was it? Oh, I'm going to go watch the Feynman video, and then I'll check out some of your other podcasts too.
Thank you so much. You have a wonderful day and stay safe.
Take care.